Hello, and welcome to American Amnesia. I am your host, Cliff Garner, and this program is being seen on Clisario 2 on YouTube, and on my Cliff Garner Facebook page. It's also there. It's also on my Facebook page for American Amnesia. I'm hoping that I figure out what I'm doing with Minds and with Gab here. It looks like Gab is coming back, which I was discussing last time I was on a couple weeks ago. Just actually not long before the election, and giving a kind of my look at what was going to occur, and a few other quick hits. And so anyway, I'm looking at getting Gab together. It looks like they're going to fix some of the issues that were going on, probably as a result of them being, I don't know, guilt by association, I suppose, with the recent anti-Semitic shooter in Pittsburgh. Lots of things have happened. I'm mostly going to look at the election and where it's, because it's still not resolved yet, but kind of where things are going, and really, in a certain sense, a sort of a post-mortem of what had already happened. Now, I and many others, but in particular, as far as I'm concerned, H.A. Goodman, were predicting that the Republicans would hold the House, although it wasn't nearly as bad as it should have been according to the wave theory. It had been a blue wave. It was not. Matter of fact, that blue wave was actually pretty sad. It was kind of a trickle. But there was also another countercurrent, and I was calling this the Groundswell. But I was expecting actually a certain amount of the black and Hispanic communities to reflect the new reality, actually, to reflect the new paradigm that's been approaching. And I've been looking at this, and I don't see. Actually, what I'm starting to see is that there was a lot more endemic cheating in Democratic areas than there was otherwise. Now, in Illinois, I'm not too surprised it turned out the way it did. Over here, we've been swamped by the corruption, but also the fact is that the Republican Party pretty much dismantled itself back in at the turn of the new millennium, and they pretty much fell apart back then. The reasons for this were rather complex, but basically we could see it with the corruption that came with our governor Ryan, who went to prison, and the rise of the Chicago machine again in all its glory, which was a part of what foisted Obama on the whole country. See, we were probably one of the first victims of this old paradigm that was really kind of coming to its end. Although part of the thing that was going on, okay, was this neocon, neo-lib new center that arose in Papa Bush's time, although it really dates back to the 60s and to the radicals, actually, the kids that were out on the streets protesting and stuff. When they pulled in the barricades and gave up on on trying to overthrow the government, they were promised that they were going to inherit it. And well, of course, they didn't want to cut everybody in on it, but they also wanted to, they were looking at a certain amount of social justice kind of issues. And so what they did was they were recreating, I should say, the black and Hispanic social orders into their social justice order, in which they would reflect them. And basically what they were doing was they were reconstructing the elite that had been there in the first place. That we've always had elites. Okay, this goes back, you know, human history from the very beginning. I mean, this is something that if you study anthropology, you start to see almost immediately to be cultivated within, even with the hunter-gatherer societies, that there was this tendency towards leadership to get certain perks and to have certain rights beyond and over others. So this whole elite issue is nothing new, and as a matter of fact, we can even say that to a certain extent it's not that bad. I mean that we do see that there are people who have more talents, more abilities, and that there are things that come with this. That there are benefits that are part of that. That even quite apart from any type of monetary or creature comforts that would possibly be thrown in, that there is a natural benefit that comes from the various differences in people and their abilities. So we can make these arguments, but at the same time, when we're looking at hereditary elites, we're not really seeing so much a meritocracy. But we are seeing that the advantages that are passed down to children are passed down to grandchildren, and so on and so forth through time. This is inevitable, and you know, we can argue about the justice of it, but at the same time, I don't think that we can entirely condemn it. But that doesn't mean that that this elite is somehow blessed or inevitable or whatever. You know, I mean, there's nothing written in stone. There is a certain amount of social mobility that goes down as well as up, and rightfully so. You do depose bad rulers, you do penalize bad leadership, you penalize bad custodianship of various kinds, whether it's financial or otherwise. That you don't reward failure. And so when these kids were pretty much promised their place in the new, in the old world, you know, basically they were told, hey, this is going to be yours. Don't tear it up. And so they went back to school, finished their degrees, and they took in professions, and they basically went the Alinsky route, to where that they were working within the system, and that they were actually trying to work changes that they thought were fitting. Not all bad, not all good. I mean, you know, you look at some of the social changes over the years. Some of them are good. I mean, just really, and some of them are going to come about one way or another, and whether they stay or not, you know, is another issue. You know, there's this idea that seems to be current among the elite now that the progress, so-called progress of the past, and they think that the Obama administration was a high watermark for this, which it truly wasn't. Actually, it was actually a low watermark. but the high, you know, the high watermark of the Obama social justice stuff, that we weren't going back in time, so that they resent what has gone on with the Trump new paradigm, because it's not just Trump, it's also the new paradigm, which is what he is riding upon. That it represents an inversion. It does not. What it represents is actually an egalitarianism that they didn't even contemplate. And that this egalitarianism that comes from citizenship, this populistic citizenship concept of equality, that transcends racial and ethnic and even religious lines, that this is a step backwards, and that's what they fail to see. They're wedded to this idea of a constant progress. This has been really a curse to the Western world for centuries, actually, going back to at least the time of the Renaissance, in which they saw everything that had happened before, or actually throughout the whole of the medieval era, as being stagnation, which it wasn't. Actually, it was a very vibrant period. And the failure for people to see this is actually really brought about a certain blindness that I find at times amusing, but at other times rather frustrating. The idea that we're in this progress of moving forward to something, there's really no agreement where it's going or what purpose it has. I mean, and when you start getting into Darwinian thinking, there is no purpose. And try that on for size. But but the idea is that there is a purposeful movement forward, and even a lot of people who buy into the Darwinian deterministic materialistic model see some type of progress at work. I mean, this is where you get into Marxism and its inevitability, and how it's all historical and scientific, and it's anything but. It's actually highly metaphysical, essentially Gnostic at its core, and constitutes quite a bit of magical thinking. So when you really break all these things down, they turn out to be something you didn't expect them to be. But at the same time, there's reasons why these ideas remain. They took on a life of their own over the centuries, and they remain at some point in people's consciousness, as group consciousness, if nothing else, as this idea of continual progress. I don't see it that way. I actually I have problems with this secularizing of what was supposed to be a religious concept. That after the intervention of Christ into the world and saving people from sin, that there was to be the church age in which things gradually got better to a point in which there was a higher moral standard, I suppose, that would reach a pinnacle at which, and of course you have differences of theological views, but in which either Christ would return and usher in the millennium, or that there would come a point at which this development would reach its pinnacle, but would lose its purpose and would be taken over by the forces of Antichrist and bring about the apocalypse through war. And those two theological interpretations of not only history but the future of human history, through a prophetic lens. This culmination that would come about would lead to progress, basically. I mean, that's really the idea there, that this progressive improvement. Now, that wasn't like that was a universal belief or anything, but there was this tendency towards that, and as they secularized the whole notion, you had this idea of progressing. And this is where progressive politics comes, and this is also where the idea of evolution leading to higher types. Think about it. This all became a secularized notion of society. And there were also people who didn't agree with the idea that people were necessarily getting better, that there was some kind of an improvement of some kind or another, that human nature would remain what it is. See, that's essentially a conservative concept, is the idea that we understand the evil people are capable of, which is the reason why we have laws and we have punishments. The progressive ideal was always to reform the prison system and use it to make people better. The improvement of man, the perfectibility of man, which this also was it was originally a Christian concept, and it probably was a pagan one as well. But the idea that humans could be perfected in some way, shape, or form is also a secularization of a theological concept. We had really very notably in right around the time of King Arthur, if he truly existed, a religious concept along that lines. That was just saying. That was oh goodness, what was that called? Because it infected the Celtic Church quite heavily around that time. Perfectibility of man. Okay, and that would have been perfection. Aesthetics, ethics, maybe. And just a second, because Augustine disputed it. It was Pelagian. Pelagianism was the idea that that man could be, or humans could be perfected morally, and the idea there was that that by faith we are saved, but we perfect ourselves by our will. And this notion just has not gone away. It is, and it's been retained in a secular form by basically your liberals and progressives, and to some extent the further left. But also theologically, it has been retained in groups of tending, very often with a Judaizing tendency, in which the legalism would be the means by which we perfect ourselves, and that this we see this with the recurrence of the Hebrew roots movement, which is the Judaizing tendency that goes back theologically to Paul's time, and also with but different movements over the years that have tended towards this idea as well. And very often there has been a political overtone, I suppose, that has emerged in different movements that occurred all through the Middle Ages and all the way into modern times. And that you see a certain amount of this with the liberalism that occurred along with the Republic, the Commonwealth of Cromwell, and just all kinds of things coming together. The rise of Shabtai Tzvi would be another thing that was a herald of this in 1666 A.D. So we have a lot of these really weird currents that we can take them back in time, and we can look at them and analyze them and see that they've never gone away, that they've returned, and they've come in new mutated forms, and that we still have them with us. And one of the more interesting ones that I'm learning about is the fact that the Darwinian, Darwin's theory, and the metaphysic that often goes with it, the atomistic, and which parts of it, I think, we can take away from the philosophy, but at the same time, that the philosophical roots have managed to really been very tenacious. And where do they come from? It was a resurgence in the in the late Renaissance and the early and all through the Enlightenment of Epicureanism, and it's fascinating. I'm studying this and finding more and more about it, and it's amazing. I am truly I'm astonished by some of the things I'm learning. It's like I would have never imagined that this was the case. But you read something about Lucretius and his work being found, and Lucretius was really the big philosopher promoting the Epicurean beliefs, which would go back even further to Democritus and stuff. These ideas were you had the Epicureans and the Stoics and the Christians were all in a competition. And matter of fact, when you look at Paul on Mars Hill, he was arguing with the Epicureans and the Stoics. And that this whole continuum, I suppose, of philosophical and metaphysical belief that has never really gone away, but has been in vogue and out of vogue over the centuries. That when you start investigating it, it's like, how much of this is still there? I mean, it's truly amazing how completely it has remained in place. And so this is where I'm getting into my papers and stuff, into my class that I'm taking, and I'm starting to see some things that I'd never imagined before, and it's really opening my eyes to a lot of other things that I would have otherwise neglected to even notice. So But anyway, I think I've now gotten so far afield that I need to double back. But this notion of progress, this idea that we are regressing, is where the pseudo-left, because they're not left anymore, they've been the establishments for so long that they're actually the right. One of the great ironies of history here. But the thing is that they don't recognize themselves as that. They think they're still kind of cool rebels, which they are not. So, anyway, this issue really puts things on the other foot. The real revolution is the fact that we have an egalitarianism that's coming up through kind of a nationalistic belief. That in itself probably shouldn't be too surprising, because one of the things that the neocon, neo-lib establishment was actually trying to enforce was the removal of political boundaries between states. And this internationalist bent really wasn't with Reagan so much. I mean, Reagan had some tendencies, but you know, Reagan was who he was. What you had was you really had more of these people that were starting to dismantle the U.S. Industrialization, even as Ford and Nixon were kind of going down the tube, and that the Democrats, who had already been subverted by the '60s rebels, were now coming into power with Carter. So this internationalism really dates more to Carter than it does to Reagan. But one of the things that they did through the Reagan years is that they managed to keep the deindustrialization of the U.S. going. What they were doing was that they were moving a lot of the business internationally, and what was happening there was that the elites of Europe and the West, you know, U.S., Canada, right, some extent Mexico, but really U.S. and Canada and Europe mostly. To a lesser extent, Japan, you know, in Australia and you know, the old English Empire, all that. What you were getting was that these old elites, these money bag people, the big corporations, the international corporations, were spreading their seed all over the place. They were making America move all their stuff around. This was the cutting edge of the globalism. This is how they were expanding their power, and they were actually subverting all the governments around the world and taking them under Western control, little by little. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, from you know, the late years of Reagan all the way up until actually the culmination that occurred under Clinton, Bill Clinton, not Hillary, of course. That this process was now accelerating, and China was being actually co-opted. And one of the things China was doing was by spreading around a lot of money to people that were just taking their money, like Biden and Obama and all those folks. It was that they were buying them off, and they were actually buying their way into a lot of this power. And so when Trump came along to dismantle that and stop it and revert the process and start sending business back home, then they've been extremely distraught. Now, these people, you know, Soros and the Koch brothers equally, And don't fool yourself. Don't think of Soros really as being a leftist. I mean, he actually espouses a dismantling of central government. What is open society is from? It's from Popper. Popper and Hayek were different. Hayek was more the libertarian. But Popper's the open society. The open society is actually a place in which goods and services are moved without any restraint. This is almost the same thing as Hayek. Hayek was influenced by Popper. You can look it up. But Popper was looking for a society in which goods and services were moved around without restraint. He was looking at basically an international economics is what he was looking for. This is exactly what Mr. Soros wants. He doesn't want to be part of the government. He wants to be the economic lord. That's what he wants. He could care less about the government, although he's got all these ideas, you know. And are they leftist? I mean, really, legalizing marijuana, that goes on both sides. Moving goods and services around, he's not a socialist. He wants the government to do what he wants them to do, but that's it. Don't fool yourself. He doesn't want a government that's going to stand up to him. People don't really get what's going on here. What you have is these big money people that don't want government. There's some things that I'm going to get into that might kind of boggle your mind here. But what I want you to see is the fact that the people that are standing up against Trump aren't necessarily libertarian or not. I mean, they're not worried about our liberty. They're worried about theirs. They want theirs. They're not going to sacrifice that, but they do want a two-tiered society. Whereas what we're talking about with Trump is actually getting rid of the two-tiered and bringing about a more egalitarian system all around, based on citizenship. That's a big difference. So when you're talking about moving people around at will, you were getting that. What you had with what Bush did in the Middle East, what Clinton was doing with what the old Eastern European and Russian areas. See, it's just kind of going bigger and bigger. And what Obama started doing in Africa, hello, and what he was actually causing a serious crisis in Syria and Libya. And if you look at the people that are being moved around into Europe, where are they from? They're from Libya and sub-Saharan Africa, and they started off with people from Syria who. Actually, Erdogan didn't want to send those people over. He was using them, the Syrians, he was giving them ballots. Just like the Democrats want to do with people coming up from Central America. Give them a ballot, tell them to vote Democrat. Well, that's exactly what Erdogan did in Turkey to hold on to power himself. He barely held on to it then. And he didn't want to send most of those Syrians up there because they were staffing his whorehouses in Turkey. I am really tired of you snowflakes who sit there and whine and cry and talk about all these poor little children that are trying to get into the U.S. and other places. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no clue what you are talking about. Those people are being enslaved by the powers that be that you think that you're against. And you are serving, idiots! Get your head out of your ass. I saw it in person. This is wrong. It has to stop. So when we look at what was going on with the election, I wonder about how much cheating there was going on. We'll find out. How we'll find out is when black people start talking amongst themselves, they'll have a pretty good idea of what the numbers really should have been. Same with the Hispanics. And we'll take a look at that, and we'll see how it actually turns out. Because actually, the reports were that they were losing a lot of their control. And for them to actually have kind of retained that kind of numbers, I'm really suspicious about what's going on here. Now, it's possible that, you know, people just kind of got cold feet when it came to voting for a populist movement. We have that parallel that happened in the populist era in the 1800s, in which blacks continued to vote for the Republicans, even though the Republicans had become quite corrupt by that time. And that the populists were actually offering another way of doing things. So that is possible. But I do have to wonder, because the extent of the cheating that we have actually seen is actually, it's alarming. They've gotten very bold because they're that desperate. I don't think there's any other way of looking at it. The desperation there is remarkable. And as we examine this, and we see what extremities actually they'll go to try to steal a couple elections. This is rather telling, and as a matter of fact, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to have a single voter's card. They do it in India. They have over 1 billion people there. They don't let other people in on their election. We shouldn't either. So that said, I'm about done for today. But I do want you to consider that a lot of these ideas are actually quite old, and they represent something that they're not being very honest with you about. There is a spiritual dimension to all this, even if you don't buy into religion. The metaphysics is still there. There is a belief system. So we need to keep our eyes open. Keep an eye on what's going on here. I have the feeling that you're going to see the Senate pretty much go back to what it was going to be originally. The losses in the House are very few. I think that does represent to some extent the groundswell I was talking about, because I didn't really see a wave. What I saw was actually that things were going to get so wetted down as that it wasn't going to change much. And what did change, I think, was supposed to be the Senate. But I have the feeling that maybe we're going to find out some cheating that was done in the House. And I have a feeling we're going to find that out real soon here. After what went on in Georgia and Florida and Arizona, and very possibly with Tester in Montana, I have the feeling that there's going to be a huge investigation and there's going to be people going to jail. I think I'm right. So, until next time, take care.